So today, in part six of the Civil War, we're going to look at the role that Civil War pictures plays in understanding the Civil War, and other parts, really the finish of the Civil War. So the Civil War is the first American war to be documented by photographs in itself. And a core of field photographers, including Matthew Brady and Alexander Gardner, are going to be following the Union troops throughout the duration of this war. And this is going to give us our first in depth look at war. And the use of photography is highly important. Here's Alexander Gardner and Matthew Brady themselves. That these are the people that would be setting up these photographs throughout. Now, due to the elaborate and delicate photography procedure, it's extremely difficult to take photographs during the actual battles. But most of the images from the Civil War are just still images, camp scenes, portraits, getting prepared for battle, group photographs, the aftermath of battles, and this is where we see some of our most vivid images of the Civil War soldiers that had died on the battlefield itself. Now, part of the overland, and to end this war, we have to start talking about the siege of Petersburg. This is part of the overland campaign, which again, Ulysses S. Grant is continually pushing forward towards Richmond, Virginia, even though he is really losing most of these battles. Um, Lee has to keep going backwards through this entire time. Um, the siege of Petersburg happens in Petersburg, Virginia, which is really just a suburb of Richmond, Virginia itself. Petersburg was the critical junction of five railroad lines that supplied the city of Richmond and Lee's army. The siege was a series of battles fought around Petersburg and Richmond. Is actually a predecessor to World War One, because we actually see trench warfare actually take place during the last battles of the Civil War. On April 2nd of 1865, Lee is going to order the evacuation of Petersburg and Richmond. On April 30th, the cities are going to surrender. The capital of the South has been captured. Now, also going on during this time was Sherman's March to the Sea, and this occurs from November to December of 1864. William Tecumseh Sherman of the North is going to go from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia, and he's going to destroy basically everything in his path. So Sherman's 62,000 man army is going to destroy crops and buildings and steal livestock and free slaves. And basically, this idea of a scorched earth policy where basically they left nothing unturned. And they used everything to keep surviving. And really, this is the first time that the U.S. history that total war is enacted. And this is where civilian centers become military targets and not just military targets are going to be really focused on at this time. So Sherman's March to the Sea is successful in the sense that they are going to bring fear to the South. So in September of 1864, Sherman captured Atlanta, Georgia, a major hub of the Deep South. November 1864, Sherman burns Atlanta to the ground again to kind of show the horrors of the war itself. In December of 1864, Sherman captures Savannah, Georgia. And from Savannah, Sherman's going to march to Columbia, South Carolina, the capital of South Carolina. And by this February of 1865, Columbia has been captured. He's then going to start moving farther north into North Carolina, which again is really encompassing most of the South that had not seen much of this war. And here is a picture of them destroying railroads. Again, destroying the railroads basically made it impossible for the South to transport goods. And this is making Sherman neckties out of the railroad rails so they cannot be straightened and used again. And then the fact that Sherman burns Columbia, South Carolina. And this is very symbolic because the fact that South Carolina was the first one to leave the Union, this was kind of a uh, retribution for that. Lead this to the election of 1864. Abraham Lincoln, the Republican, is going to run against the Democrat George McClellan. Abraham Lincoln obviously was the president during the Civil War, and George McClellan was his general for much of the beginning of this war, and they did not get along. So the fact that George McClellan runs against Abraham Lincoln is very telling. Now, George McClellan's really focus was the fact that this war should end at this point, and Abraham Lincoln says no, we should finish this war and finally finish off the South. Now, the election could have easily gone against Lincoln, But Sherman's capture of Atlanta showed that this war was probably coming to an end and is going to help him immensely when it comes to winning this election. But it is a very close election because people in the North were tired of this war. But this leads us to the siege of Petersburg, which, again, last we left off, Lee was surrender was escaping Petersburg and Richmond. So after the siege of Petersburg, Lee and his troops retreated from Richmond, headed west, intending to join the Confederate forces in North Carolina, but they weren't able to make it. And on April 9th of 1865, Lee's armies battled Union forces and was forced to surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, where him and Ulysses S. Grant are going to meet and talk about old times or the fact that they'd actually met before. But they're then going to quickly go to the terms of surrender. Now, this is really going to show how the mentality that needed to be done for this country. We needed to come together, and Ulysses S. Grant was very sympathetic to the Confederate soldiers. So the terms of surrender were that soldiers would not be imprisoned or prosecuted for treason, which they very well could have been. Officers could keep their pistols and swords. Soldiers could take their horses and mules. And Lee was actually given food rations by the North to distribute to his starving army. And again, these are all great measures to kind of bring this country back together. It shows a trust that this is ending. But Lee's surrender did not end the war completely. They're still fighting in the Carolinas and Georgia and Florida. Now, very soon afterwards, on April 14th, 1865, John Wilkes Booth, along with others, had a plan to assassinate or basically cut off the head of the federal government. And that included William Seward, Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant himself, and others. The co conspirators attacked and wounded Secretary of State William Seward, but Lincoln is going to be the only one that's actually killed. John Wilkes Booth sneaks into the booth of the Ford Theater, in which he is pretty much a famous actor in this sense, and sneak up behind him and assassinate the President of the United States. Vice President Andrew Johnson is going to become president after this. And this is a picture of Ford's Theater itself. And this is the actual box, the presidential box where he was slain at. Now, the war is officially going to end really in April 26th of 1865. The largest surrender of Confederate troops occurred when Generals Johnston and Beauregard surrendered to General Sherman at the home of James Bennett near Durham, North Carolina. The 89,270 Confederate soldiers were given the same surrender terms as the soldiers at Appomattox, again showing that the North needed to pacify the South in some form or some way. The war is officially over. Some of the results of this war shows that the federal government is going to play a bigger role and a more legitimate role in the lives of everybody. Before it was states' rights, but now the federal government truly is going to be a major power and show that the states are subordinate to the federal government at this time. Inflation, which the decreased value of money, which also really is important because the South had created their own money and now that money is basically worthless. So the Southerners have gone bankrupt at this time. Women are going to work for the first real time, taking care of the farms and working in positions that they never had access to before. The fact that slavery is going to end with the 13th Amendment uh, is another major result of this war. And really, more than 620,000 people dying in this war is one of the biggest impacts because that's a huge part of the population of the United States. And think of the families that are going to be affected by this. $15 billion in war costs and property losses, the majority of that in the South. So the South is going to have to be rebuilt. The South was in ruins and the fields and the farms and the cities at this time. So they needed the help of the North to get back. But this also helped transform the Northeast into an industrial power. So this really is the end of this war and the devastating part of American history.